This week, our interfaith platform explores the theme, the power of soft power. Our distinguished guest today is a dear friend of Chautauqua, and clearly someone you all like, Bill Moyers. Bill has been recognized as one of the unique voices of our time. His career in broadcast journalism has spanned 5 decades and earned him more than 36 Emmy Awards, 9 Peabody Awards, 6 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Awards, the National Humanities Medal from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Penn USA Courageous Advocacy Award, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and just to boot, an honorary Doctor of Fine Arts from the American Film Institute. So not accomplished at all. He and his wife and creative partner, Judith Davidson Moyers, have been responsible for such acclaimed PBS series as Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth, America's First River, The Story of the Hudson River, The Language of Life, Genesis, A Living Conversation, Faith and Reason, The Wisdom of Faith with Huston Smith, Amazing Grace, and many, many others. Until their retirement in 2015, they produced the weekly television series Now with Bill Moyers, Bill Moyers Journal, and Moyers Company. They have produced and created various award-winning investigative documentaries, including The Secret Government, The Constitution in Crisis, Buying the War, How the Press Enabled the Invasion of Iraq, Two American Families Are Struggling Middle Class, and Free Speech for Sale, How Money is Changing Politics, again among many others. Most recently, the Moyers team received the Robert F. Kennedy Humanitarian Award for their documentary reporting on the culture of cruelty in New York City's largest and most notorious jail, Rikers, as well as the Cannes Festival Award for Diversity. Bill graduated from the University of Texas, studied at New College Divinity School at the University of Edinburgh, and received his Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Texas. Before beginning his prolific career with public television, he worked as a liaison in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, became a founding organizer of the Peace Corps and its first deputy director, and served as special assistant for domestic policy to President Johnson and then White House press secretary before resigning to become publisher of New York's Newsday. He's also the senior correspondent for the CBS documentary series CBS Reports, founded by Edward R. Murrow, and for 5 years was senior news analyst of the CBS Evening News. He is president of the Schumann Media Center, a nonprofit organization for the support of independent journalism. The Moyers have 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren and live in New York City. The title for Bill's lecture today is The Other Face of Power. We're most grateful to the Carnahan-Jackson Religious Lectureship and Endowment Fund held by the Chautauqua Foundation for providing support for today's interfaith lecture. So now, please, let's give a very warm welcome back to Chautauqua to Bill Moyers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that generous welcome, and thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. I'm indebted to you and Maureen Ravegno and Jean Roberts for bringing me back to Chautauqua. You know, this is just such a lively place, and you are such lively people that when I come alive just stepping out on the grounds here, these beautiful grounds, it means a great gift to me, because here's a true story. I retired from broadcast journalism some 3 years ago, after almost 50 years on the air. A year or so later, I was waiting at Union Station in D.C. for the train back to New York, when a woman about my age, a little younger, approached me with a quizzical look on her face. She asked, "Weren't you Bill Moyers?" "Once upon a time," I answered. She said, "Well, I'll be darned. I didn't think you were still with us." "Well," I said, "I think I am." She appeared a bit nonplussed. and I figured that she must be a news junkie. So I said to her, "You probably have confused me with some other on-air journalists who are gone now. David Brinkley, Howard K. Smith, Paul Duke, Charles Kuralt, Walter Cronkite, all of them have passed." She was still unsure. And as she turned to walk away, she said over her shoulder, "Well, I always watched you when you were alive." So you know why I am so pleased to be here at Chautauqua. Just being here proves I'm still here. Carpe diem, as they say. A friend of mine who's familiar with Chautauqua and the program here asked me about the subject of the week. I answered, "The subject of the week is soft power." He thought for a moment and then replied, "A whole week about detergents?" I started to reply sarcastically, but then stopped. I said to myself, well, soft power is a kind of cleansing agent, and it has healing properties, as I hope you will appreciate when we finish this afternoon. So I'm not going to tell him any more about it than that. Everyone here knows that hard power in foreign policy is, of course, force employed to get what you want. When politicians can't get their way through diplomacy or negotiation, they call on the military. When Lyndon Johnson was majority leader of the Senate, he would challenge his opponents to compromise by quoting from the Bible, the prophet Isaiah, "Come now and let us reason together." After he became president, he turned to hard power, escalated the war in Vietnam, and came to regret the choice. The classic example of soft power in my lifetime was the Marshall Plan, 1948. At the end of World War II, on a continent devastated by clashing armies, Europe lay wasted and starving. People were homeless and desperate. So the United States poured in $12 billion to rebuild Europe and to prevent it from falling under the control of Stalin's Soviet Union. Humanitarian aid, food and medical care, money to rebuild transportation and communication networks, public utilities, educational exchanges. It was, I think, after the defeat of Hitler, our finest hour. Then 30 years later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of East Europe from communist control, it seemed that soft power would define the post-Cold War era. Soft power is the power to persuade, none of which I have with my wife. The term was coined by the scholar Joseph Nye, who described 3 ways to influence the behavior of other countries. You can induce them with threats backed up by the military. You can induce them with money, bribes, or you can try to reach their hearts and minds and win their cooperation. It's a central paradox of American power, Nye writes. The sheer might of the United States is unquestioned. U.S. troops, as we speak today, are in more than 160 countries, and our military expenditures are roughly more than the next 7 countries combined, more than China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, Britain, and Germany. And yet few peeps were heard 2 weeks ago when the House approved a new military spending budget of $1.4 trillion over the next 2 years. The rest of the government, let's call it for the moment the soft power side of the government, including the Veterans Administration, will get $1.3 trillion. That's $178,600,000 more for hard power than for the whole rest of government. Some $30 billion of that will go to our nuclear arsenal. Speaking of which, and because hard power has its cheerleaders, In a recent survey, 1/3 of the American people approved the idea of a preemptive first strike against North Korea, even knowing a first strike would lead to the death of over 1 million people. So hard power is back. When the president proposed cutting the State Department's budget for diploma, the then Secretary of Defense said, "That means I will simply buy more ammunition." So with all our power, who would be foolish enough to declare war on us? Yet we may want to keep in mind the fact that we were the world's only superpower in 2001, and that didn't prevent 9/11. The fact is, as America's military superiority, its hard power has increased, its ability to persuade is at low ebb in many parts of the world, even among our oldest allies. Hard power has its limits. Soft power is the very opposite of force. It goes beyond the military, beyond money. It's about getting others to cooperate without coercion, without force, without sanctions, without bribes, without threats. A country succeeds with soft power when other countries admire its values, want to emulate its example, and seeks to achieve the level of prosperity and openness. In a way, the character of a country's civil society is just as important as its official policies. Are its laws fair? Are its values appealing? Does it keep its word? We'll hear more about soft power and foreign policy during our session on Thursday with Andrew Bacevich, a friend of mine, a graduate of West Point and Princeton, where he earned his master's and doctorate in diplomatic history. Andrew Bacevich served in Vietnam and the Gulf War, retiring as a colonel. After teaching at West Point and Johns Hopkins University, he joined the faculty at Boston University. We met when he first came on my weekly PBS broadcast to talk about his first best-selling book, The Limits of Power. Other books followed, adding to his reputation and influence among thoughtful readers across the spectrum. He has a following in liberal, centrist, and conservative worlds. His new book, The Age of Illusion, will be published in January. I started reading the bound galleys of it last month on a park bench in New York City on the hottest day of the summer. Even with the temperature above 100, it sent a chill down my back. I'm not kidding. It's, like an ice cube along the spine. Truth can wake you up. Andrew Bacevich is a truth teller, and you'll want to hear him on Thursday. Tomorrow at this time, you'll meet Hardy Merriman. Hardy spent his life on the front line of nonviolent resistance, soft power, as a champion of human rights and political change. He's now president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict based in Washington, D.C., and is passionate about ordinary people organizing, strategizing, and mobilizing to overcome adverse conditions, win their rights, and hold the power accountable. When Hardy sees writing on the wall proclaiming that it can't be done, his response is, let's take down the wall. On Wednesday, Heather McGhee will talk about how soft power shapes public opinion and public policy. You'll love Heather. She's one of the most dynamic young women at work in the world of ideas and policy. An inexhaustible optimist who really believes we can change the future. She was president of the progressive think tank Demos in New York, where she remains a distinguished senior fellow, is writing a book and advocating for equal justice for all in a multiracial democracy. She and her husband are also busy raising their son. You'll love her. You've got quite a week ahead of you. Unfortunately, I have to return to New York this afternoon for personal reasons, and I won't be here as I had hoped to listen with these guests and then to converse with them. But you're in good hands, and they will have a great audience. Okay, Gene, the introductions are over. That was your time. You can start the clock. This is my time. And I want to confess to you that I love thinking out loud with all of you. And that's what I want us to do this afternoon, because there are no answers to some of the dilemmas that we're going to discuss. I want us to think about soft power as the very essence of democracy, everyday democracy, how we live, work, and survive together. This won't be exactly the talk that I plan to have. The mass shootings upended those intentions. So have stories I have been reading the last 3 days of Americans frightened by what's happening, who are thinking or talking about leaving the country or already packing. Many say they no longer want to live with an increasing level of daily fear. A father in Tennessee with 4 sons, ages 4 to 14, told the press, first it was a shooting once a year, then once every 6 months, and now it's every day. The way things are going is where you can't even take your family out in public because it's just a matter of time. I would like to move somewhere where this isn't true and my kids don't have to be afraid. Now, of course, people are not flocking to the exit, but the very idea gives us an insight into the state of our gross national psychology. Violence, fear, despair. I will tell you that at my age, I'm not afraid. The side effects of a long life are catching up with me anyway, and I'm not afraid. But I confess to being very depressed about the fate of our democracy. The frequent sound of gunfire repeatedly echoes a breakdown of society, a paralysis of the will, which is the scourge of any civilization. What's happened to democracy that it appears to have lost its way and certainly its resilience? People sometimes ask me what I've learned about democracy in the 50 years I was a journalist, plus the 7 years I served in government in the early 60s. I've condensed my response to 3 lessons. 1, democracy is easier to celebrate than practice. It often produces the opposite of what you expect or want. And like any great ship at sea, may sink through the mutiny of those on board, the officers on the deck, and maybe, or the passengers on board. That's why John Adams has been on my mind lately, one of our founders, a great statesman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, an architect of our system of governance, and the successor to George Washington as our second president. Adams was a student of history, especially history as tragedy. And he learned from that history that what can be gained can just as easily be lost. Remember, he wrote to another patriot, John Taylor, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy, John Adams said, that did not commit suicide. Adams feared oligarchy above all, the rule of the few. It was humanity's oppression, wrote one historian, at the hands of the wealthy that Adams thought most likely, and it was that which he most dreaded. He knew that democracy, the rule of the many, is by its very nature precarious, unstable, and can go awry. He said the unruly might vote us out of our house. But the greatest danger, he said, would come from financiers, speculators, and wealthy merchants who would use their fortune to influence government to increase their control even further. There are men, he said, who will not suffer themselves to be governed, but will knock to pieces every plan and model that the most honest architects in legislatures can invest to keep in bounds. Why did he actually think that democracy might follow autocracy and monarchy into the dustbin of history? Because he understood the desire for wealth to be rooted in the psyche. He knew human beings could be self-interested and exploitative, prone to easy corruption. He believed that wealth is politically powerful not merely because money buys influence, but because citizens even admire and identify with the rich. In his own words, when it comes to the temptation of power, quote, democracy is no less vain, no less proud, no less selfish, no less avaricious than aristocracy or monarchy. These passions are the same in all men under all forms of simple government, and when unchecked produce the same effects of fraud, violence, and cruelty that individuals cannot overcome. Nations and large bodies of men never conquer themselves. So what did Adam say to do? Try to protect the rights of citizens with a complex of institutions capable of controlling and elevating their passions, and trust, it said in a direct quote, trust no man living with the power to endanger the public liberty. So let's do the math. Adams reckoned that democracy in Greece had lasted about 250 years, and that it was just about that length of any democracy that has ever survived. So somebody do the math for me. If we take our marker as either 1776 with the Declaration of Independence or 1789 with the ratification of the Constitution, how many years do we have left before we have to put John Adams' timeline to the test? What do you say? About 30 to 40. About 30 to 40 years before that 250-year marker, if it were to hold, stretches up before us. One of our most prolific public historians died in May at the age of 95. His name was John Lucas. He was born in 1924 of a Roman Catholic father and a Jewish mother in Hungary. He survived forced labor under the Nazis, survived the bloody siege of Budapest, and escaped deportation to a death camp by finding refuge in a cellar. During the last months of the Second World War, he made it to America. Never saw his parents again, never stopped pondering how freedom is so precious and fragile, and civilization so vulnerable. He channeled a little John Adams, and in the last essay he published before his death, he concluded that the modern age, what he described as a 500-year period, the last 500-year period of history, is over. He described the chief characteristic of that period as the rise of democracy, by which he meant majority rule, and as the chief feature of its age. He was very impressed when the young French observer Alexandre de Tocqueville toured America in the early 1930s and saw that what was happening here was to de Tocqueville more important than the French Revolution, maybe even more important than the Enlightenment, because democracy, said Tocqueville, went beyond politics to engage the lives of entire people. And so Tocqueville said the great movement of history embodied here in the United States was the transformation from an aristocratic to a democratic age. And it was, Tocqueville wrote, monumental and irreversible. Monumental, certainly. Irreversible, John Lucas wasn't so sure. Who do you think will be proven right. Think about it. I don't know. But here's one phenomenon at work that I've seen as a journalist. Remember when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Britain famously said there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals? Just recently, the British economist Umar Haque came across a headline in England that made his jaw drop. It read, "Schools in England are beginning to close a day early a week." Why? Because, the story said, there's not enough money in the budget to pay for educating kids anymore. And this economist said, who on earth in the 21st century wants their kids to be uneducated? Why would any country, especially in the 21st century, happily want their kids to be dumber? And then he gets serious. When I look around the world today, it strikes me that we're living in the age of the sociopath. An age that no longer believes in the great historic idea of society itself. Sociopathic to the point that nations like America and Britain are simply beginning to shut down their public space, to collapse when it comes to basic social functions and structures. And he said, when you look at a generation of leaders failing ruinously to deal with any of the great challenges of the 21st century, inequality, climate change, mass extinction, crumbling infrastructure, it's because most of them are profoundly, immovably hostile to such a thing as a society we should and must care for to begin with. When you look at fractured, riven countries, one after another, plunging into authoritarianism, it's because large numbers of people have become deeply opposed to the notion of living or being part of a society, not just their society, but living beside anyone and caring for them, investing in them, nurturing them, period. People, he said, are actually investing in the corrosion and even eventual collapse of democracy. Because when there's little social investment in society, it will soon grow impoverished. How can democracy function when people have nothing left in common? The core of democracy is about rights we give each other. It's about choosing what's best for everyone, not just yourself. It's about treating every citizen as an equal in political stature. But now the world is divided into people who believe in society, its principles and values, its founding notions, and people who don't. People who believe in something more like tribalism and Darwinism and authoritarianism and hate, violence, and rage. There is a deep social nihilism at work in the world today, a kind of disbelief in the very idea of we. And from this hostility, from this enmity, comes a surging aggression, a bitterness, a rage, and an animus that's tearing the world apart. No notion of a commonwealth, a public interest, shared values can emerge if people don't believe in society to begin with. And in the end, runaway inequality, growing poverty, which means the collapse of a middle class, and the erosion of the notion of a public interest, what do they culminate in? They culminate quite naturally in the corruption and eventual collapse of democracy. I grew up in a small town in East Texas, the son of the poorest white man in town. But my best friend was the daughter of the richest white man in town. And although we lived on different sides of the town, we went to the very same good public elementary school, to a good public high school. We played together in a good public park. We enjoyed games at the good public miniature golf course. We went down good public highways to good public universities. And she had, I don't know how many times the money we did, but we shared something in common. We shared the culture. We shared the institutions. We shared the values of that little town, irrespective of the fact that she was enormously rich and I was very poor. That's what is meant by hostility to society. Your kid can't get an education? That's okay, mine does. You don't have public health, good health? That's okay, I do. That's sociopathic. And here's what's happening as a result of it. There's an organization of researchers and scholars based in Sweden that every year measures the state of democracy around the world. The 2019 report is out, and here are some of the findings. Democracy still prevails in a majority of countries in the world, 99 countries with 55% of the world's population. But the number of liberal democracies, those that live by the rule of law, has declined from 44 in 2008 to 39 in 2018. At the beginning of this year, about 1/3 of the world's population lived in countries that were becoming more autocratic. That means their leaders are beginning to limit democracy and to rule more unilaterally. Among them are several Eastern European countries such as Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and Serbia, and populous countries such as Brazil, India, and the United States. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in the world has now been cast back to where we were almost 30 years ago, around 1990. For the first time, the freedom and fairness of elections has started to decline in more countries than it is improving. Freedom of expression and the press are under severe attack by governments around the world, and the rule of law and civil society is being eroded. Toxic polarization in the public sphere is an increasing threat, and societies are dividing into distrustful, antagonistic camps. Political leaders in country after country are increasingly using hate speech in many countries. Most autocratic regimes use the internet to manipulate what people see, read, and know, and political elites' respect for opponents, for factual reasoning, and for engagement with society, what Tocqueville called the engagement with the public, is declining in many more countries than it is improving. And that's bad news, because once political leaders and their followers no longer believe that political opponents are legitimate and deserve equal respect, they become less likely to play by democratic rules in the struggle for power. Would you believe that this same opinion poll, taken in both the U.S. and Turkey, show that citizens are increasingly reluctant to accept someone who supports another political party as a spouse, a friend, or even a neighbor? You may have heard of the annual report called the Democracy Perception Index. It's the largest single global study measuring citizens' trust in government. It's presented every year at the Copenhagen Democracy Forum Summit in Denmark. The last report found a huge crisis in the electorate around the world. More than half of respondents in democratic societies said that their voices rarely or never matter in politics, and 64% believe their government only rarely or never acts in the interest of the public. The director of data and polling for the survey concluded that the biggest risk for democracies is that the public no longer sees them as democracy. When I was thinking through this talk, I saw a headline in the New York Times that read, "Politicians don't care what you think." A team of scholars had worked for 2 years to find out how much attention state legislators give to the concerns of their constituents, because they said, to a large extent, democracy depends on this assumption: the belief that voters should be reflected, however imperfectly, in the leaders they select. But what these researchers found is that an overwhelming majority of state legislators in the United States were not interested in learning about their constituents' opinion. Voters' views seemed almost irrelevant. Is it any wonder that while median wages stagnated in America for 4 decades, both parties were largely indifferent to what was happening to everyday working people? Or that steadily growing social inequality in the country was met largely by a collective shrug of the shoulder? Or that increases in economic insecurity and poverty, in which the vast difference between rich and poor went like this, were much talked about but largely unaddressed? Or that our infrastructure across the country was allowed to crumble? Or that drug costs skyrocketed with no relief? Or that college costs soared and the student debt reached $1.5 trillion with no action by our political class? Or that cries of despair ended in death by opioids? Or that all this time dark money was at work flowing through the arteries of politics to make sure crony capitalists got their regressive tax cuts and government services and all the spoils of one of the greatest explosions of wealth in history? People lost their trust in democracy over the last 40 years because it wasn't working for them. In one national poll, 3 out of 4 Americans agreed that the laws enacted by our national government mostly reflect what powerful interests want, not what everyday people need. So we're left with a kind of pseudo-democracy, an illusory system of government engineered to serve the powerful while shedding any accountability to those it was meant to include. That's the bad news. The good news is there is another way. And if we're going to save democracy, and I mean that, if we're going to save democracy in this 30 to 40 year period we have before the culmination of John Adams' timeline, we have to use soft power. Now, we journalists are professional beachcombers, an expert in nothing. Professional beachcombers on the shores of other people's experience and wisdom. So let me call in some witnesses to make the case for me. First witness, Nicholas Christakis. He teaches social and natural science at Yale, where he co-directs the Institute for Network Science. And he's recently published a remarkable book with the title Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. He spent years in research in social science, evolutionary biology, genetics, neuroscience, and network science. And he makes the case, you didn't know this, I'll bet, Gene and Michael and Maureen, when you chose soft power for the theme, he makes the case that we are genetically wired for soft power, if you will, a process of natural selection that has favored people prone to constructive friendships, kindness, love, and cooperation. He writes, "We each carry within us an evolutionary blueprint for making a good society. Genes do amazing things inside our bodies, but even more amazing to me is what they do outside of our bodies. Genes affect not only the structure of our minds and hence our behaviors, but also the structure and function of our societies. This is the source of our common humanity." He began to think about this over 25 years ago doing his work as a hospice doctor. "Death and grief," he wrote, "unite us like nothing else. I've held the hands of countless dying people from all sorts of backgrounds, and I don't think I've met a single person who didn't share the exact same aspirations at the end of life, to make amends for mistakes, to be close to loved ones, to tell his or her story to someone who will listen, and to die free of pain. Christakis writes, the desire for social connection and interpersonal understanding is so deep, it is here with us to the end. Now, he acknowledges he's taking on Darwin, Charles Darwin, who thought of the dark side of biology as the war of nature. For Darwin, the very heart of evolution is competition, what he called the endless struggle for life most severe, the survival of the fittest. And Christakis also admits he's riding against the grain right now because in the United States we're driven by polarization, right and left, urban and rural, religious and insiders and outsiders, have and have not. Both political polarization and economic inequality are at a century-high peak. Americans are engaged in vocal debates about everything, about the inexorable pool of tribal loyalties and about whether the ideological commitment to the melting pot and to a common identity as Americans is feasible or even desirable. And he asked what for him is the key question. Can you love your own group without hating everyone else? That's the question we have to wrestle with. And we've got a good start because of our genes. But we have to wrestle with that very seriously, all of us, if we're going to save our democracy. He insists that you come with a social suite, S-U-I-T-E, of features. That you arrive in this world as a squirrely infant with this social suite inherent in your genes. Let's call it, for our purposes this week, soft power. That from our capacity for love, friendship, and learning, and even our ability to recognize the uniqueness of other individuals, these ancient tendencies work together to allow people to achieve individual and collective objectives while at the same time minimizing hatred and violence. Let me just tell you very briefly about Christakis' passion for shipwrecks. Shipwrecks have a hold on the imagination, of course, going back thousands of years. Homer's The Odyssey, Shakespeare's The Tempest, Robinson Crusoe, Swiss Family Robinson. They told Christakis in his research a lot about how societies came into being and how they fall from grace. During the period of European exploration, through the advent of modern navigation, there were more than 8,000 shipwrecks. In the great majority, everyone on board went down to a watery grave. And some represent a grimly familiar breakdown of social order that includes not only murder, but cannibalism. Those that most interest the scholar are those where survivors made landfall and set up camp. And he found that groups that typically fared best were those that had good leadership. Take the wreck of the Julia Ann on a reef in the Pacific on the 7th of September, 1855. 51 people stranded for 2 months until the captain and crew of 9 volunteered to row 3 days into the horizon to get help. All 51 survivors were eventually rescued because of their heroism. A newspaper later reported, Captain Pond's chief desire throughout the whole sad affair seemed to be to save the lives of the passengers and crew. While the crew were engaged in getting the passenger ashore, using a lifeline from the wreck offshore, Mr. Owens, the second mate, was going to carry a bag containing $8,000 belonging to the captain ashore. The captain ordered him to leave the money on the ship and bring the girl ashore. The child was saved. The money was lost. Talk about leadership. Christakis tells us this visible act of altruism at the outset powerfully established an example for the group to cooperate and work together. He's very fascinated with the contrasting stories of two wrecks at the same time and place, the Invercargill and the Grafton, on opposite sides of Auckland Island in 1864, just a year before our Civil War ended. Neither was aware of the other, and they provided, says Christakis, an almost natural experiment in how social orders work. One crew was led by a captain who seemed mostly interested in his own survival. The men splintered into groups and finally resorted to cannibalism. They landed on a rocky beach at the foot of tall cliffs with no shoes, few clothes, a pencil, and some matches. Leaving one weaker man to die, they set out across the island. Along the way, they abandoned other members of the party who were too weak or injured to go on. One man was eaten. 3 were finally rescued, including the captain. All the lower-ranked seamen, except one, died. The men from the other ship on the other side of the island stuck together and worked collaboratively from the very beginning. Despite some disagreements, there were tremendous cohesion, tremendous loyalty to the group. The captain had been very sick when the ship foundered, but the men refused to abandon him and took him along with their rope. Under his guidance, they built a cabin, a forge and bellows made of seal skins, which they used to fabricate nails and tools from savage metal. Using a Roman recipe, the captain made concrete by baking seashells and combining the concoction with sand. He also crafted chess piece, dominoes, and a pack of cards, which they later discarded because one of the crew was a bad loser and started fights. They were often from different nations and taught each other foreign languages and math. The captain later said that their impromptu school equalized them. We were alternately the masters and pupils of one another, the captain wrote, by alternately raising and lowering us one above the other. They really kept us on a level and created a perfect equality among us. He then proposed the men should vote and choose one of themselves, not a master or superior, but a head or chief of the family. His duties, the captain wrote, include maintaining with gentleness, but also with firmness, order, and harmony. Guess who the men elected to this position? The very fellow who had been the poor loser at cards. And he remained in this capacity for the 2 years of their ordeal. He and the captain and a third man set sail in the repair dinghy and made it to New Zealand. Then they turned right around and went back to the island and rescued the 2 men who had trusted them to return. You cannot have Chautauqua without trust. You cannot have a state without trust. You cannot have a country unless we trust each other, basically, knowing we're flawed and we're going to make mistakes and there'll be mutinies in our midst. But you can't get anything done unless you trust people whom you barely know. They brought into being a functional society. Christakis concedes humans have a parallel propensity for animosity and violence which can contribute to collapse. But living socially, democratically, we might say, is the blueprint for whatever success we achieve. And blueprint is the title, remember, of his book. Kindness and altruism, or alternately nastiness and avarice, may depend heavily on how our social organization, our social society is organized. But he concludes, we are inclined by evolution to make a particular kind of society, a good one, full of love, friendship, learning, and cooperation. Second witness, Martin Nowick, director of the program for evolutionary dynamics at Harvard, a mathematician. For more than 2 decades, he's been cooperating with many other great minds to solve the mystery of how natural selection can lead to mutual aid so that competition can be turned to cooperation. The urge to cooperate is the soft power to counter the hard power in the war of nature, an alternative to destroying each other in the fierce struggle to survive. You'll find the argument in his witty, cheerful book entitled Super Cooperators, Altruism, Evolution, and Why We Need Each Other. Human societies in particular, he said, exhibit a degree of cooperation unmatched in all creation. He's not a gullible optimist. He knows Darwin's struggle for existence most severe. The lion crouching in the long grass of the African savanna, muscles tensed and senses tightly focused on a nearby animal. Slowly, the lion stalks the antelope, and then suddenly, in a burst of speed, sprints toward an animal, grabs him neck, and pierces the skin, blood vessels, and windpipe with its long, sharp teeth. It drags the prey to the ground and holds tight until the antelope breathes its last. When the lion finishes with its kill, a shroud of vultures wraps the bloody remains. That's reality. Chalk one up for hard power. Sounds like our presidential campaigns. Competition, he says, does not tell the whole story of biology. Something profound is missing. Creatures of every persuasion and level of complexity cooperate to live. Some of the earliest bacteria form strings where certain cells in each living filament die to nourish their neighbors with nitrogen. Some bacteria hunt in groups, such much as a pride of lions hunt together to corner an antelope. Ants form societies of millions of individuals that can solve complex problems together, from farming to agriculture to navigation. Bees tirelessly harvest pollen for the good of the hive. Mole rats generously allow their peers to dine on their droppings, providing a delicious second chance to digest fibrous roots. And meerkats risk their lives to guard a communal nest. Human society fizzes with cooperation. Our breathtaking ability is one of the main reasons, he says, we have managed to survive in every ecosystem on Earth, from scorched, sun-baked deserts to the frozen waste of Antarctica to the dark Prussian ocean depths. Our remarkable ability to join forces has enabled us to take the first steps in a grand venture to leave the confines of our atmosphere and voyage toward the moon and stars beyond. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Apollo. Of course, cooperation waxes and wanes. The degree to which individuals are able to cooperate rises and falls like the great heartbeat of nature. This is why, even though we are extraordinary cooperators, human society has been and always will be riven with conflict. And now, he says, global cooperation teeters on a threshold. The accelerating wealth and industry of Earth's increasing inhabitants, us, is exhausting the ability of our home planet to support us. Too many people with too little room and dwindling amounts of food. There's rising pressure on each of us to compete for the planet's dwindling resources. What the world needs today, he concludes, is super cooperators, soft power. Last two witnesses, Maya Savovitz and Bruce Perry. She's a science journalist, former colleague of mine, who's been exploring the question, is human nature fundamentally selfish or altruistic? And the noted child psychiatrist Bruce Perry. Together, they wrote the third book that I recommend to you this afternoon, the bestseller, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Then they followed it with Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. They remind us of what we have forgotten about children. That from birth, when babies' fingers cling instinctively to those of adults, their bodies and brains seek an intimate connection, a bond made possible by empathy, the ability to love and to share the feelings of others. But they also remind us that our culture is beginning to rob children of necessary human contact and deep relationships, which are the essential foundation for empathy and caring. Here's what they say. By understanding and increasing just this one capacity of the human brain, empathy, an enormous amount of social change can be fostered. Failure to understand and cultivate empathy in our children can lead to a society in which no one would want to live. A cold, violent, chaotic, and terrifying war of all against all. Our choice, your choice and mine, because nobody's going to come and save our democracy. We have to do that. If we don't do it, it won't get done. So our choice, our country's choice, is chaos or community. I'd like to close on a personal note. I think of Gilbert McAllister a lot these days. He taught anthropology at my alma mater, the University of Texas, and he first exposed me to the grandeur and glories and difficulties of anthropology. I relished hearing him describe the time he spent among the Apache Indians when he was a young graduate student out in West Texas. That's where he said he learned about reciprocity. Yes, that's right, reciprocity. In the Apache tongue, he said, the word grandfather is the same word for grandson. Grandfather, grandson, both from the same word. The Apaches believed in the reciprocity of generations, in both linking and locking one generation with another. Reciprocity, mutual help, reinforcing, soft power. Time and again in this class, he would look back over the sweep of history and tell us that human beings have advanced more through having learned the value of cooperative, caring behavior than through competition. I remember sitting on the front porch with my father, talking about growing up on the Red River that separated Texas from what was known then as Indian Territory before it was admitted to the Union as Oklahoma. Life was hard. My parents lived day to day. My mother lost twins, then lost another girl. I was supposed to be the first girl, and I didn't make it. They lived day to day, and they moved from the philosophy, they survived by moving from the philosophy of live and let live to the philosophy live and help live. You helped to deliver one another's babies. When a family was sick, you took turns sitting at the bedside or helping with the meals. And when a neighbor died, you helped dig the grave. My father was 14 when his own father died during the flu epidemic of 1918. Neighbors washed my grandfather's body, and neighbors dug his grave, and neighbors laid him away in the earth. Even as late as my high school days, my father was one of several men in town who would sit up all night beside the corpse of a friend, a vigil of friendship to counter the lonely silence of death. My father usually took the midnight shift, midnight to 6 or 7 in the morning. Why did you do that? I asked him. You had to drive a truck all the next day. Why did you sit up all night beside a dead man? Without pausing, he said, because it was the thing we did. The thing we did. The poet Gwendolyn Brooks has said our task, you and me, our task is to fill a space with civilization. And what is civilization? It's a web of cooperation, joining people to family, friends, communities, and country, creating in each of us a trust in the whole, a recognition of the self rooted in companionship with others, through powerful loyalties to the political, metaphysical reality of we, the people. Listen, civilization is not natural. It is, in fact, an unnatural act. But that's the point. Civilization is not what just happens. It's what we make happen. It's the thing we do. And we can't make it work unless we agree on the difference between a horse trader and a horse thief. The distinction is ethical. Without it, society is a war of all against all, and a free market for wolves becomes the slaughter of lambs. A stable and honored system of law, clean and safe streets, secure pensions for workers, and schools where children learn enough to cope with the world, whether they live in poor or rich neighborhoods. All of this is part of the bargain we strike with each other. And the bargain is civilization. Why do the young die in battle for their country's sake? Why do old people plant trees they will never sit under? Why do we pay taxes to support schools we will never ourselves attend? Because we're all part of a big and beautiful idea known as we, the people. America, every one of us, from all over the world, men and women, black, brown, yellow, white, young and old, all of us, wherever we're going together. But we're all together in this nation and on this one planet. There's nothing out there. This is it, folks. There's not an alternative. I'm not going with Musk. But we are all together in this nation and on this planet. You and me, us. And we're all called to affirm the big we. Look it up in the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people. Thank you.
We have time just for a couple of questions, but that right there, that's why we love Bill Moyers. We'll start right over here. 1, 2, and 3. We'll see if we can get there.
Thank you very much.
Nice and close to the mic.
Yeah. So this is a nurture and nature question. You said in every one of us, we are genetically programmed to be altruistic. And yet, in the example of the shipwrecks on the opposite end of the islands, one that came to the fore and the other did not. So is that culture overriding our natural state, and somehow we can strip that away. Which leads to the question, is it possible to uncover or unshield in those that are Trumpian, if you will, and reveal their inner good?
I don't know the answer to that question. I hope you'll ask Christakis or Norwick that next summer when they're here. I don't know the answer to that question. And when an atom splits, what decides where its particles go? I don't know, but that happens. I mean, we can be programmed. We both have the gene for love and generosity and friendship, and the gene for violence and selfishness and competition. I don't know how. Nurture certainly does it. Christakis believes that much depends on the way the society is organized, just as my friend Maya Savalovich and her partner, the child psychologist Perry, believe that the child that comes into the world grasping that finger needs to be reminded to be nurtured and keeping and with a finger that responds. I don't know the answer to that question. It happens. It's one of the mysteries of life. While two twins may be from the same womb, they go in different directions. I don't know the answer to that. We keep finding it, looking for it. Yes, over here.
I hope by your witnessing the reception you've received here that you fully recognize, notwithstanding your friend in the train station, that you are a living American hero of democracy and journalism.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I consider myself just a journalist licensed to explain things he doesn't understand. Okay?
That was the good news. It's interesting to me that your 50-year career in journalism coincides with a serious deterioration in the quality, the production, and the diversity of the fourth estate of democracy, i.e. journalism and the media function. And any comments you have on that deterioration, I would appreciate. Secondly, I would
Sorry, not secondly.
Okay.
All right. The media universe, from social media to print newspapers dying, to local news, to Twitter and all of that, the media universe is a wild west now, many wild wests, and we don't really understand it. There's a remarkable story in the New York Times this weekend about how Sweden, which used to be a prosperous and progressive society with a great social contract, is now being roiled by misinformation and fake news coming in, much of it from Russian sites because they want to see what they can do to create trouble with all the democracies in Europe and with the help of far-right extremist sites wherever they're located, many of them in this country. But that's impossible to penetrate. In some ways, I mean, I have missed being on the air the last 3 years in the same way that a professional military officer might retire not knowing that World War III is going to break out next week. I've missed this big war, but in a way I'm relieved because I honestly don't have the vocabulary to describe to you what this alien force is that's entered our body politic, entered the arteries of our system. And I'm not talking about one man. I mean, Trump is a symptom of what I was talking about earlier over the last 40 years. He came along at the right time for himself, for his people. But I don't understand it myself. When I became press secretary, against my will, by the way, when the president ran through so many that he had to finally come to me, my father sent me a telegram. I still have it. It said, "Bill, tell the truth if you can, but if you can't tell the truth, don't tell a lie." And that was the tension. That was the counter pressure I always felt. I couldn't always tell the truth. I didn't want to bring down the stock market or cause the first division in Vietnam to lose a battle because of something I might have indiscriminately and indiscreetly said. But I did my best, and not always successfully, not to tell a lie. Now it seems lying is not only accepted but honored. I don't understand that. It means you really have to work hard as a citizen. And this is what I didn't say. It is hard to be the citizen of a democracy. Because I said, nobody's going to save it for you. You have to save it. But if you work at it, you can separate the wheat from the chaff in the news. Be careful of what you subscribe to. Be careful what you read. Don't take anything for granted, and never use your first impression as your Bible. But it's hard. And it's really troubling that there is now an alternative universe that is untrue, that has no regard for the facts, that is based upon lies, that competes with mainstream journalists whom I admire because they're trying. You know, our job, I always have said, when I speak at journalism schools and with young journalists, by the way, you have a very good one here, who's writing for the, covering this meeting. I hope to meet him later. I couldn't see him before I came because I wasn't well. But I always said the mission of the journalist is to get you, we're your surrogate. You don't have time to do what we do. To get you as close as possible to the verifiable truth. Produce some evidence, some logic, some reason that helps you to think this is possibly the reality that I need to know about. There's no effort in much of the not mainstream media. There's no effort in much of the of online journalism, online media sites. It's a very, very serious effort. I could go into what John Adams wrote about the importance of information, but that is a difficult question.
One last question.
No, I'm sorry about that.
Nice and close to the mic.
For those in the last lecture, this might sound familiar, but do you think that we should think in the way of John Adams, to think in the way of the founders that...
Wait, you're talking a little too fast.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Do you think that we should think in the way of the founders, in the way of John Adams, in that the challenges of today are new, the documents and the structures that we have today cannot handle them, and therefore to reform and update the founding systems that we work off of to solve these problems?
They were, many of them, very learned and wise men, and they were well worth reading, and I think many of them were earnest about trying to create a workable government that would protect people's rights. They were, of course, many of them deeply flawed on the whole question of slavery and all of that. I don't think we should take them literally. I think we should try to figure out what they were saying in the context of today's world. And I don't think we should be unilaterally bound to a document that was drafted in 1775 and 1776. I think, as conservatives on the court have shown, and before them liberals, the law is a living thing. Law is interpreted in the context often of today, and it should be. And, you know, think we're governed by with a Department of Transportation on a Constitution built when there were only post roads, dirt roads that led to one city to another, it's a mistake. And we need a wholesale revision and an updating of our Constitution. I don't know how we do it, because once you open it, you really are inviting the hornets in. And I don't have an answer to that. But continuing debate and conversation in which we challenge the literal interpretations of the court by whether it's a liberal or conservative majority. I wish I could take all these questions. I apologize. I talked too long. Thank you.